And as promised, we're back this week to pick up where we left off and get into part 2 of 2, all about creating custom sweeps. And if you remember last week, I was very cautionary about using terms to strict definitions. So we all define sweeps differently. We all define risers differently, but that's really not what this is about. This is about hearing the techniques and then having your own word that you associate with that particular sound. Not everybody is a native English speaker. If you're more comfortable in your native tongue, for example, you'll want to use a word that makes sense to you based on the sound that you're getting, based on the technique itself. And that's really the focus here in this tutorial, is on the technique, is on the sound, and the naming, the words you use, that's entirely up to you. Even from this website just being live for a few months, I've seen how easy it is to have a discussion with somebody who's probably a very experienced music producer. They know their stuff, and yet we can be having this very awkward and strange conversation about something because we're defining terms differently. In music production, there are no definite definitions for anything that you do, because we all associate words differently based on our experience in the DAW. The other thing I need to mention right off the bat is that if you haven't watched part 1, I recommend that you do that, because I'm assuming that you've already watched that, you've understood it, and so you'll be able to very easily then combine what we talked about last week with what we'll talk about this week, so I don't have to re-show anything, because, it's already out there. No reason to beat a dead horse. It probably already happens a lot on this website, so I don't want to do any more of that if I can avoid it. So this week we'll be using a different technique as the basis for creating our transition effect, and that technique is to reverse it. So everyone's favorite reverse button in the DAW, that's what we're going to be focused on, and really kind of taking it to the extreme, and also doing some other fun things as well that may not involve reversing. As I wrote here, ramps, and ramping as compared to sweeping. What's the difference? I have no idea. I just thought that reverses and ramps sounded good together, so we're going to go with it. And actually, ramping does work, because we're going to be ramping things up or ramping them down, not just necessarily sweeping a filter in and out. So as we move along in this tutorial, I think you'll understand why the word ramp is actually pretty appropriate for at least a couple of the specialty effects that I'm going to be showing you here. In order to do this, we are going to be recycling parts within a production as the means for these transition effects. And by recycling, what we're really doing is being resourceful or being sustainable. So we're going to be working smart, not hard. That's not to say that working hard is not useful and sometimes is the way to go. Like last week, we really started out with this big block of noise and then from scratch had to create that custom sweep. Here, we're going to be recycling parts, and in some cases only having to hit the reverse command and being happy with the results. So working smart, not hard. That's not necessarily a life philosophy that you should adopt or a music production philosophy that you should always adopt, but in this case, it certainly will come in handy. And like always, the techniques shown can be applied in any DAW. Hopefully by the end of this tutorial, you learn the technique, you learn the concept, so that if you ever do go from one DAW to another, one piece of software to another, it very easily will translate along with you. That's always the goal and point of everything we do here on this website. It's about learning the techniques, not necessarily just learning the software and how to specifically do something in one particular, DAW, plugin, whatever. Reverse it. This is really the main idea of the entire tutorial, is that everything can be reversed as long, and this is kind of important, as long as it's an audio file. So you might have to do some bouncing here, which I know some people vehemently hate, but it's something that I think is very useful for you as a music producer, makes your life a lot easier. And of course, this can be done on a small and a large scale. So I gave you two examples here, and things that you probably hear all the time in music, even things that you probably do in your music. You could take like a clap sound or a snare sound, and you could reverse that and then have it actually be the lead-in to the actual forward-sounding clap. This is something done in hip-hop and in just, EDM drum beats all the time. That little bit extra emphasis, you hear that sound coming in reverse, and then it, boom, hits the impact. So very small scale, but something that's effective and just, to put it simply, works. Or you could have a reverse cymbal crash, so a 15-second long sample, and this could serve as more of a general transition going from, say, the verse into the chorus, or from the chorus into the bridge, or however you're defining your different parts in your arrangement. You can have the reverse effect play a really big role on the larger scale of the composition, larger scale of the arrangement, or on the smaller scale like what we have there with the reverse clap effect. You can reverse strings, pads, atmospheres, natural sounds, so forth in their default state, so as is the sample itself. And this can actually serve practical functions. It can allow you to create new parts, things that sound organic but not really organic. There's that little special feature about it, something that makes it a bit more electronic if you're making electronic music in any sort of state. So don't be afraid to reverse everything, right? It's like in America, we deep fat fry everything. And I'm sure some of those experiments have gone horribly wrong. But then again, you deep fat fry like a candy bar, and who would have thought that would be a good idea? You eat it and you're like, oh, wow, this tastes really good. And then afterwards, you have to go to the doctor and they have to clear out your arteries or whatever. But same idea here with music production. You can reverse everything. You only know if it's good or bad after you try it. So you can never make that assumption that, oh, I can't reverse this because it's never been done. That's all the more reason to actually give it a go and reverse it. As well as, a very classic effect here at the bottom I just threw in. You could reverse a vocal, and by reversing a vocal, it can serve multiple functions. It can actually sound very beautiful. And I was just listening to this song a couple hours before recording this video, and Maiden Heights Murakami, that's an example where the reversing of the vocal actually sounds very beautiful and anticipates the vocal playing straight back in regular motion, what we expect to hear. And it has a very profound and interesting effect. It draws the listener in. It anticipates the actual vocal. So reversing a vocal and pitching it down to do more of the Exorcist demonic sound isn't the only thing you can do. So the sky's the limit when it comes to reversing. It's all about application, trying new things and just seeing if you can make it fit, seeing if you can make it work. And more often than not, you actually can. We're not going to be doing anything that shocking, that new, or that amazing here in this example, but at the very least, you will learn the sound and the way in which you go about reversing audio files. Of course, it is different in every DAW that you encounter. In some DAWs, you're able to right click and choose reverse audio. In some DAWs, it's going to be up in some kind of file menu up here. And then in others, you do get the option, right from this little sidebar menu here. And in this program, they call it the inspector panel, where you can do a lot of different things to your audio clips if you so choose. So just make sure that you go in, you consult your documentation. You should be able to do a very simple like Command F or Control F and just search the word reverse in the manual. And the way you go about doing that should come up upon a very quick and easy search. So we're just going to go through a few different examples here so that you get the sound in your ear and you start to understand why you might want to do this. You really have to do this in the context of your own music, and you just have to experiment. So you hear a part, you think, I wonder what that sounds like reversed. You reverse it, and then you start trying to pick and choose a place on the timeline where it's going to fit in. That's really the way I go about reversing, unless I know, for example, that I need like a riser effect, which we'll be looking at here in this second example, actually. So here we have this little drum loop going. And this is a common situation people find themselves in where they have this all in a MIDI clip, and here we have a drum machine. So one thing I could do is I could go into the snare sound if that's the part that I wanted to be reversed. And let's say that the reverse moment I want would be right here. So it'd be, and then a reverse for the second one. I could go in and I could do something like even automate the reverse control in the sampler. Let's just see if I can hit it in real time. Like, very difficult to pull that off, but right? Or you might think, well, why don't you just duplicate out the sampler and then, have one of them with it going in reverse? That's really not the way that I like to do things. If I'm ever doing any kind of reversing, I want it to be an audio file because I get a lot more control than if I have to try to do it inside of a sampler, keep everything in the drum machine. I then start to get confused. Where is it located? What do I want to do if I have to process that separately, and so forth? So the best way to go about this, especially if you don't know where that sample comes from, I could always go back into my sample browser and try to find it. But what would be easier is just to create a new clip, say, okay, that's falling on the C# one, go down, find C# one, solo it. That sounds like it's the entire sample to me. And then I can just go and I can bounce it. So upon bouncing it, now I do have the original audio clip. I can turn it up, I can turn it down, whatever. But I can now at least go in and line it up where I want it to be. So I'm going to line it up right here. And what I want is the reverse effect. So I want to reverse into the following hit. So I can get rid of this. Right now it's just going to sound back like normal. But simply enough, I can go in here and I can reverse it. So you might be thinking, that doesn't sound very good. And no, it doesn't. And that's because we're actually capturing that final little transient burst. And so this is very common. That sometimes causes an issue when you're trying to bring it into the next hit. So I'm just going to go in here and I'm going to get rid of some of that. So let's just get rid of it all the way up to here, drag it over, snap it into place as best we can. And now let's take a listen, see if that sounds any better. Yeah, I like that quite a bit more. I can even turn it down a little bit on the way out. And then what I'd probably do is, because I already have this stretched and we're getting ahead of ourselves because we're going to do this in the next video, but I could go and I could actually repitch this so that it doesn't have that kind of annoying click in to the next snare hit. So I could just go and take this down, maybe a couple. Yeah, that's definitely better. I'm even thinking I could get rid of more of this. So something like that sounds cool, a little syncopated. Yeah, see, I like that. I'm getting so far ahead of myself, I just can't help it. So you can see how easy it is to just kind of experiment, mess around. This is totally off the grid, but for me at least it fits in quite well. So that would be on a much smaller scale. So that's within the context of just this simple 2-bar loop. And if we were to duplicate this, we could choose whether or not we want to keep bringing that over. One thing I will show you that I do like to do in this situation would be to consolidate it and just fill it out, just so I know, okay, I can very easily then, if I was to take this and want to, for example, duplicate this part out, I know that I can then very easily go in, snap it, and it still has that syncopated off the beat feel, but it's easy to move around on the timeline. So a little bonus for you there, especially if you work in this program or other programs that give you containers for your audio clips. All right, next example here. We'll go through these much quicker. If you want something a little bit longer, so you want this to actually be fading into this drum loop here to trigger or to let the listener know that this is coming up, a transition effect in all of its glory, I can just go into the cymbal crash here and I can just start by reversing it. Let's listen to it straight. And then we can go and we can reverse it. And then it's just a matter of kind of lining this up. And now as we play this back here, get rid of the loop. So apart from it being quite loud, yeah, that works fine. And especially if we were to then go in and have other things happening at the same time, I think you could see how this could work. Okay, the next one that's always a lot of fun to mess around with is something like a vocal part. So let's just listen to this vocal in isolation.
My laugh will probably be a sample.
Okay, so with that laugh at the end especially, I think this will be fun in the reverse. We might only use that chuckle at the end, but when we reverse it... So at the end there, you definitely know that, okay, this person's just gone in and they've reversed the vocal. They're probably going to run it through a vocoder, make it sound demonic. But if I wanted, I could just isolate out those like laugh hits. I think those came here. Yeah, we'll just take that. And then if I go in and grab it, this can now be a part of this, okay? And maybe the reverse is also leading into that. So let's actually line it up like this and just check out how this sounds. All right. So you wouldn't necessarily know that that's been a laugh that's been reversed. And this is kind of the beauty of doing this stuff, is that you can bring it in there. There's sort of this resemblance to something that's organic or something that's natural, a sound that you're familiar with, but you can't quite put your finger on it. So I think this would be a perfect example of something like that. And last but not least, you can take actual organic sounds. For example, we have this Moscow Metro train platform sample that's been taken. And that actually sounds pretty cool on its own, but if I go and I reverse it, it's just going to have this very interesting texture-y kind of effect. So let's just chop out one part of it here. And of course, I'd probably in real life go through, listen to the whole thing, consolidate it, take it, and then reverse it. And now we can listen back. Very cool. I like the sound of that. I can just bring it in with the rest of my little loop here. And now we can bring this all in together. Nothing really new with this next slide here, where we're going to reverse the sound and then we're also going to do some pitch movement to it. So once you have that audio file bounced out, that also usually means you have access to the repitching algorithms inside of your DAW. So this is, again, maybe more of that ramping effect. So you have something that's reversed. It's already feeling like it's ramping up. And then if you go and you add that extra bit of pitch motion in there, it can take it over the top. So pitch dives, either up or down, may help the reversed part act more like a transition effect and less like, oh, this just sounds like a reverse cymbal crash. That's something that most of us can actually pick out. Oh, that's the origin of that sound. It's something that we've all heard a lot of times. So you add in that pitch dive and now suddenly it's a little bit more experimental, maybe isn't the right word, but a little more electronic, a little more processed, and then can have the effect of being more of a transition effect. So you really feel like the energy is building and it's moving somewhere. And by extension, using stretch or repitch algorithms, something we did a lot last week, this can get you some really interesting results. And we're going to look at one kind of experimental technique that not a lot of people do. I actually did it just recently in a collaboration with somebody on the website. So I'm going to show you something that's really cool. You may not be able to do it in your DAW, but I know at least in Ableton Live and in Bitwig Studio, this is possible. And it should be possible in any DAW where you're allowed to automate the actual global BPM. So we're going to talk about how to do that and then also how to actually export it so that you can use it as really a specialty effect. So we'll jump back into the DAW and look at this. We got ahead of ourselves a little bit by doing some repitching in the last little DAW example video, but now we're going to go in and take it a step further and talk about a couple of things that we didn't talk about, namely what happens when the file that you've brought in is not in a stretch mode or it's not in a warp mode. Every program has different names for this, but fundamentally it comes down to whether or not the audio file you've brought in is going through any kind of time stretching algorithm. So right now with this saying raw, it's telling me that it hasn't gone through any sort of time stretching algorithm. It's just the sample itself, and we can listen to it and we can reverse it. Nothing special, nothing new about that. But the problem here is that I can't go in, I can't repitch this. You can see that this box is grayed out. I can go in and I can try to draw something, but it's just playing back the raw audio file. That's all it's doing here. So it's not going to pay attention to any sort of pitch change because we're not using one of the repitch algorithms. Nothing's changed. It's still the raw sample, simply reversed. So what I have to do is I have to apply one of these stretch algorithms. But notice what happens when I go into stretch. It's cut off some of the sample, and it also is giving me a tempo of 120. So what all these programs try to do is they try to guess the BPM of the sample you bring in. I have no idea why they try to do that because it's almost always wrong. And now if we listen to it, we have some problems. This doesn't sound that similar to the original that we brought in. We've also lost some of the sample. I should be able to recover that, but if we listen to it, it sounds very different. You can hear the graininess, and that's not what we want in this example. We just want to be able to repitch this. We want it to sound like it's in its original state. And to do that's actually very easy. You just need to go in and find where the tempo is, where it's guessed it, and manually override it to the tempo of the track that you're working on. So in this case, it's 128. This is now our original sample brought back. And we can tell that by going in and reversing this back to its original and just listening to it. We could put it into raw mode. And then back here into stretch. Right? Virtually no difference. Maybe subtle, but not a whole lot. So we're going to go back. We're going to reverse this again. And I could bring it right up here so that it's going to rise into this right at the end of 8 bars. It's probably easier to actually just collapse this guy down and then line it up like so. And now I can go in and I can repitch this, or I could have it do some kind of pitch rise and fall. And again, with something that's unpitched like this cymbal crash, you don't have to stick to octaves. I just tend to do that out of habit. So now we can listen to it. Add some curve in here.
My laugh will probably be a sample.
I didn't even know that I lined it up like that, but you can see how perfect that worked, right? A great little transition effect. And in this case, going into something that you never would have expected. The other strategy that you can use with reversing is a little bit more extreme and experimental. And so we're going to use this Moscow Metro ambient sound to accomplish this. So I'm going to go in here and I'm going to do what I did before. I'm going to put this into a stretch mode and I'm going to change it to 128. Okay? And then I just want to go and I want to consolidate it and make sure that we haven't lost any of the sample. I'm probably going to go in here and just grab a moment of it. You can actually see this is very long. So I'm just going to go in here and I'm going to grab a moment of this. A train must be coming there. And we'll just take this section of it here. We'll get rid of the rest of all of this. This is still now in a stretch mode, so we should be able to repitch it. Yep. We'll go in and we'll reverse it. Very nice. And now we're going to start to get a little bit experimental. So I'm going to, first of all, consolidate this. And now I'm going to give myself a lot of room on the end here. And again, you're going to have to consult your DAW's documentation on how to do this. But what I can do is add a stretch marker. And now I'm just going to yank this and make it really, really long. So we're going to get a lot of artifacts. And we could then go in and we could try to mess with these settings. That probably sounds the best to me. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the pitch and I'm just going to drop this by 12 or so. That might actually sound cooler. And the issue, of course, is that there's going to be a lot of low end, things that we can't even see. So I'm just going to get rid of some of that. And just like that, you've created this really interesting texture. If you were making some kind of like really old school kind of distorted like hip hop trap beat, something like this could work great as a texture element. And this started with just a basic little ambience. One other thing that you could experiment with, and this is again a little bit more experimental, is actually working in the repitch mode. And when we work in the repitch mode, we're going to adjust the tempo. And by adjusting the tempo, it's actually going to change the pitch. We can do something really drastic. Then we could go and we could take something like an LFO, and then we'll mess around with this control right here. We'll mess around with the frequency, slow it down, maybe use that random, and also mess with the gain. So you can always do something like that. So this involves not only throwing it into reverse, but then taking advantage of some of the repitching, time stretching algorithms that are bundled inside of your DAW to then come up with entirely new textures or backgrounds, really things that are very difficult to create any other way. Obviously, I've lost the plot a little bit because the main point of this tutorial is about creating sweeps. And of course, you can actually then use this as the basis for a sweep effect. It's going to be more of the block of noise sweep effect, but a sweep effect using reverse nonetheless. So if we go and we just kind of close this down a little bit, we can always go back in and we can take some kind of a filter and do more of a sweep action with it. And I might actually do two different things here. Not only will we use a filter, but also an additional EQ. So let's take the ladder filter here. We'll have a little bit of LFO action that we will increase over time. Okay, something like that. And then obviously bring that frequency up some. So you're thinking, wow, that still sounds like really, really dark. And the answer is it does, but we can brighten this up with a couple of different techniques. The one thing that we can't do in this example is now change the pitch since we are working in repitch mode. We could do it by adjusting the global pitch here and doing something at the bottom, but we're going to get into that in a later video. But for now, I actually want to make this brighter at the end. So to do that, I'm going to use two different effects together. I could use the bit 8, but I think I'm just going to use the regular distortion. And I'll also use an EQ. Okay, so let's see how this works. All right. There we go. So if I take this mix out and then bring it up at the end. We could actually put this then before the filter and then add a little bit more of a drastic motion. So this is a different kind of sweep effect, isn't it? This is more of a very like subtle almost effect. It's something that you'd almost use to break down as compared to rising up into something. So that's a little bit different. If we really need to force the effect, though, we can always use more of a bit crusher at the end. Something like that, right? So there's always something you can do, and this is part of the fun of making these, is that when I started this, I had no idea how this was going to turn out. I would have never guessed that I would have ended up doing this and adding this sort of a chain, but this is sort of the fun of doing it and doing it from scratch and just, you know, experimenting. You never know what will work and what won't work unless you try. We just couldn't do a tutorial on reverse effects without going to everyone's favorite, the classic reversing reverb. And this is very simple to do. You isolate the reverb, or in some cases you have a mix of reverb and also dry signal, and you reverse it. You bounce it out, you reverse it. Okay, immediate transition effect right there for you. Simple but effective. And when you start to combine this with some of your additional processing knowledge and some additional processing techniques, you can really get some fantastic results. So this comes back to that idea of recycling things in your production. Using parts in your production that take well to reverb and using this technique will add an element of cohesion and what I call just a belonging to the production in general. So it's easy to work on something and to use 4 or 5 different synthesizers. You have samples from, 5 or 6 different sample packs, and you're wondering what's going to bring all this together. And in the mastering stage or in the mixing stage, you might use the same EQ, you might use the same compressor, you might, put a compressor on the master bus, whatever. But even within the production itself, this is a fantastic technique to help tie some elements together because you're using something that's already in the track, and the listener will pick up on that. They may not be able to say, oh, okay, that reverse effect is clearly based on a reverb from the crash cymbal, but you can tell, And so I think it's really important that in production, we find that healthy balance between differentiation, where all these different parts are coming from, getting that element of variation, but then you also need to always be thinking, okay, variation, cohesion. Music, tension, release. There's always this yin and yang process going on in a track, in a well-balanced track. And so this reverse reverb effect can definitely help you with this. And we'll also look at the cliche, a very classic ghosting vocal technique. So we'll be setting that up, and you'll probably be like, oh God, not again. But it's worth showing you because it's definitely relevant to this idea of reversing reverb. So you've just gotten to see some fairly experimental techniques, and we are going to return to normalcy in just a second. But I wanted to remind you that just because you end up somewhere doesn't mean that you're done. You could always take this guy and you could bounce it, and then you could add even more effects processing to it. So in this case, I just added a little bit of gain on the end and also a pitch rise after doing the bounce, which of course, after doing the bounce, by default, it goes into a stretch mode. And now we could hear how this ends. We could even then put a different filter on there. The sky's the limit, on and on and on, but you can easily chase your tail for 4 hours. So let's leave it at that and go in and talk about reversing reverb. But we'll now return to a little bit more normalcy and talk about reversing reverb, a very classic effect, and really not that much that you have to think about here, with the exception of, do I want to start by reversing the sample and then adding reverb, or do I want to put reverb on it at the beginning, bounce it, and then reverse it? If that didn't make sense, I'll just go through both options here very quickly. So we have our cymbal crash here, and we're going to bring some reverb on. We can either set a balance, or we can set this to be 100%. Either way, doesn't matter. Well, it does matter. It's just about the context. And normally you're going to set the pre-delay to 0, and you're going to set the mix to be fairly high. But if you wanted, you could always actually go in and get more of a balance. But for our purposes, we'll turn this up quite a bit. And now what I need to make sure I do is I need to make sure I consolidate this and just have enough room to grab the majority of the reverb tail. So because this reverb time is so long, I need a lot of additional room. So you can see I've added that in there. I'm going to bounce it. We now have this cymbal crash with reverb. We can turn this reverb off for now and just work with the bounced file that we have. So what I like about this technique is that I can reverse it, and then I can really kind of just get the area that I want. So I may not want all of this feeding into the top here. It's going to be pretty drastic, as you can hear, but that actually sounds pretty cool. But what I might do is even just go and just take the first part of this and then do some clip automation instead. So add a little bit more gain at the end. And then we could go in here and we can change the pitch, since this is something that we have bounced. So we'll have the pitch drop this time. Let's have it happen actually just immediately. Yeah, something like that. I love doing this sort of a maneuver. Immediately. It's really being a pain today. There we go. Okay, so something like that might work, and you saw the strategy and the steps for doing that, which was to actually bounce this out in straight mode and then to reverse it. But we could also go in and start by, and let's just move this out of the way, we could actually start by reversing this to begin with. And then if we're going to do that, we have to make sure we consolidate, give ourselves a lot of room at the end. In this example, I'm going to go ahead and put the mix up to 100%. Seems to work better that way. And I'm just going to go and I'm going to bounce it. Okay, so now you can see what we get here is quite a bit different looking, and also will be different sounding. So this is what it sounds like with the reversed file and the reverb all the way set to be 100% wet. Okay, so now I kind of have to go in and I have to reverse it this way. So this is just a different way of looking at things. And a different kind of sound that you can get. So it's really up to you. I actually tend to like to start it going forward, and then I just reverse whatever the result is of that. But it doesn't really matter that much either way. Of course, I have to show you the classic reverse reverb vocal trick, something that is referred to as like a ghosting vocal, and it's actually quite easy to set up. So we're going to start with the vocal here. I'm going to begin by reversing it, and then I'm going to just drag out a decent amount of space here to make sure that I get the reverb tail, and I'll set something really long just to make this drastic. We can listen back to it. Note that I have the reverb set to be 100% wet for right now, and the reason is because this is what I'm planning to use as the effect. Once this is done and bounced, I can delete it and get rid of it, but the effect itself, at least how we're setting it up here, is 100% reverb. And all all of the juicy good stuff is what's happening there in that tail. And that tail is actually the beginning of the audio file. That's why you reverse it. If we were to flip it back around, we note that this is the start. Okay, and that makes a big difference here. So I'll go ahead and I'll bounce this. And so this is the reverb. And now what I have to do is take both of these guys and reverse them back. So I'm going to get rid of the reverb, and I'll take both of them and reverse them back. And now what we can listen to is how we ghost into the vocal. So let's play it back from about here.
You don't know me at all.
So typically you actually just go and you take that ghosted version and you cut it off right when the vocal starts. That's kind of the point. So you get that sort of swell in. Hit play a little early there, didn't I?
You don't know me at all.
This can take a little bit of tweaking to the point where you might want to go in and do a little bit of like manual volume control on this. So
You don't know me. You don't know me. You don't know me. You don't know me. You don't know. You don't know me. You don't. You don't. You don't know. You don't. You don't know me. You don't know me. You don't know me.
that's kind of fun.
You don't know me.
Additional processing. Yes. I don't think anything else really has to be said here. And as I wrote, honestly, this does go without saying. So I don't need to go back into the DAW and talk about different ways you can probably process things further. This is something that we've looked at and talked about so many times on this website. And as I've mentioned previously, this is a great way to start to develop your unique sound. If you're an artist, come up with effects chains that you think sound really cool on transition effects and use them time and time again. Obviously, you'll dial in slightly different settings, but this is a fantastic way to start and develop your sound. People will start to familiarize your transition effects and say, oh my gosh, so-and-so has this really cool way of making transition effects. I know that sounds kind of lame and silly, but it's true, and it's something that can certainly help you down the road. So you'll just have to experiment, work with some of the techniques we've talked about before, or just go your own direction and throw it at the wall and hope something sticks, because eventually something always does. Automation. Yes. Again, this goes without saying. And if you remember last week, we spent a lot of time on this. And so more than anything, this is just a review to you that if you want more energy, more of a sweeping motion, more of a ramping motion, you will add automation, and you can experiment with anything because the listener is not expecting a lot, right? They're expecting an energy build. And by automating any parameter, especially right at the end of this sweep or of this transition, that's going to do it for them. So you don't have to freak out and think, oh, there's only one or two things I can use. No, you can mess with everything and just hear what sort of results you get. Get experimental. This is where you can have fun. This is where the rules don't apply anymore, and you can just think about creating some really cool sounds. And also, if you have macro controls in your DAW, you can set them up so that by just turning one knob, we'll move 5 or 6 different parameters on a variety of effects, and that makes the whole automating process a little bit more fluid, a little bit more fun, and you don't have to get so technical in there of drawing in all your little automation points or trying to get that perfect recording of, turning a MIDI knob. I always struggle doing that. So this is a great way, one single knob and a lot of things moving, because these effects, like your track, if you're going from verse to chorus, there's a big movement, there's a big shift happening, and you want to anticipate that. And so transition effects are a great way of doing that. So automation, yeah, absolutely. It doesn't have to be extreme, it can be subtle, but always that little bit of movement can go a very, very long way. Last but not least, we'll go in here and add some kind of a unique processing chain to this little ghosted vocal part here. But the question you might have is that something that's really necessary? If we listen back to this,
don't know me.
Apart from the volume being a little bit high, I would say that that's pretty much good to go for this style of music. For whatever backing track is probably going to be added with that vocal, you probably don't need to do a whole lot more than what you already have. The reverse reverb trick works really well. So you don't always have to go in and take things further if it's not going to be appropriate. But we can imagine that this is actually serving as our transition effect in general, and it's just going to cut off right here. Okay, so this is it now, and maybe we want to do something a little bit more interesting. So we can listen back to it. And let's add a few different effects to this. And for the sake of example, I'm going to use a macro control. If your DAW has that, definitely take advantage of it. I know they're in Ableton Live. They're here in Bitwig Studio. They have it in Guitar Rig if you happen to own that plugin. And it just makes turning one knob a lot more fun and a lot more dynamic. So we'll just add a few different effects to this. We'll add our ladder filter, and I'm kind of just choosing these at random. We'll choose a frequency shifter. We'll choose the rotary control, and then we'll also go in and add that tall chorus. If we want to get really experimental, I think what we'll also do is go down, create an effect track, and add on some sort of a delay effect. And in fact, I might get that set up first along with the filter. So I'm going to put the ladder filter at the end of this chain. And for now, I'm going to turn off these other effects, and I will come back to them in just a second. So one thing I can do is I can set this control to the frequency. And we'll just test this out first to make sure that it's working. Okay, so I might do a motion similar to that. And I hate to draw in the motion already because I would probably prefer to do this in real time. Maybe we'll draw it in and come back and then record it again. So maybe something like this. And the resonance I will draw in manually. Okay, cool. Because what I want with this delay throw is to just get that last, probably even just this motion. So I can actually go and I can already set that up here. Do something like this. Okay, so let's set this one to be, and we'll just throw that over. And we'll throw this one over. We're not going to do anything too fancy. Okay, so something like that. If you wanted, you could obviously go even further, but if we listen to it, I really like the way that sounds. That's really cool. But let's start to bring these macro controls in and do something a little bit more interesting. So let's bring in this tall chorus. And I'm going to turn this off now because it's already annoying me. But what I think I'll do is I will set this to control... what do I want to control on it? We'll just have it control the dry wet, okay? We'll be lame. So something like this. And I'll start it out a little bit lower. Okay, cool. I definitely like that. We'll go and turn this down a little bit so we're not getting any clipping. We can go in with the rotary. I definitely want to... Actually, you know what we can do? This would actually make more sense. Why don't we use a different macro control for everything else? So I've already gone in here and started, but this is exactly how these sort of things end up going. So I'm going to get rid of that one. So this is only now controlling the frequency. And then this other one could control everything else. It could even actually go and control this resonance. So we could get rid of that. Set this up like so. Go in, have this also controlling the dry wet of our chorus. I want it to control the amplitude, but really the amplitude here just sets how extreme it is. So I want that to, at the very end, to be going pretty extreme, and we'll also have it increase the rate. And then with the mix, I'm actually going to have it do a little bit more the opposite for here. So I'm going to set this mix, and I'm actually going to have this going down as this goes up. Okay, so that's exactly what I want. We'll bring this in a little bit. Okay, so that should be pretty cool. We'll just have a little bit more resonance there at the end. And then we can just go and we can record something with that. So there's a lot happening. It's actually not too extreme. It's not as drastic as if we had distortion, but there's still a lot going on, and all of these guys are interacting in different ways. Let's even bring it so that the rate will come up even more. Perfect. All right, so let's try to get a pass on this. I'm really bad at recording automation, in case you weren't aware of that already. All right, and then when we have the delay turned on, this is going to make this even crazier. Nice. And so if I just go and turn the volume down a little bit, we're definitely cooking. And then we just go and just add a little bit more feedback. Where's my cursor? There it is. And there you have it. That would be processing this a little bit further. Of course, you could do a million more things. This is just one simple example, and I hope that you take all of these ideas and concepts and make them work in your own music. Final thoughts. There are even more techniques for creating transition effects. We've really only scratched the surface and talked about a handful of strategies and ideas for really, I'd say, just kind of getting started with transition effects. This isn't an open and closed book by any stretch of the imagination, but if you've gone through these past 2 tutorials, I hope that you have a lot of ideas if you ever wanted to make these guys from scratch. This particular approach, the reverse and ramp strategy, is all about being resourceful and recycling things from within the production. And that's important because I think far too few of us even think or, realize that this is possible. We're so quick to look elsewhere. Let me go to that sample pack. Let me go and look it up on the internet. Let me go here. Let me go there. When oftentimes the answer is actually within the project that you're working on. So, once in a while, be resourceful. Try to MacGyver it. See what you can come up with. And usually it's a lot more fulfilling this way, especially if you're an artist needing that desire of, okay, I really did this myself. And I know personally that's something that I struggle with a lot, is wanting to feel like I've done it, that my stamp is on it. Not everybody is the same way, so if you want to use samples and it's convenient and easy for you, by all means do it. This strategy, this approach, requires a lot of experimentation, requires a lot of practice and a lot of patience. So be kind to yourself. If you're not able to get a really cool effect the first time, try it again. The thing I love about transition effects is that there are no rules, and it's really hard to fail. Normally 9 times out of 10, I actually don't have to repeat the process. I'm able to get something on the first go, which is actually very strange and rare for me. Typically, if I'm even making a lead part or a bass part, I have to do it 2 or 3 times before it actually fits and works. So transition effects, very much an experimental domain where, you'll be happy with results that aren't maybe what you expected, especially because it's a lot of fun to just go in there and throw automation around willy-nilly. You can get away with it here, so you might as well do it. In many other aspects of music production, you really can't be so freeform. And just like last week, I want you to be thinking in terms of song context and song energy. So try to get these things to fit if you're working from scratch. That's the real benefit to doing this. And obviously, I want you to combine what you learned in the previous tutorial, because everything here at the Sormena project is building on itself. And if you remember that, if you keep that in mind, I really think you should have no problems creating some really interesting and unique and practical transition effects for all your future productions. So I hope you learned something new. Thank you for your attention. And until next time, take it easy.